Last week, I posted a video about the new discovery of dark oxygen being produced at the sea floor. And on that video, I got a whole bunch of really great questions that I want to try and cover in today's video. So I'll start with a quick recap of what we covered in that first video, and then I'll move on to the questions that came up and go through them one by one. If you haven't seen that first video, I will link it up to the top right for you if you want to check it out before moving on with this one. So a group of scientists discovered that molecular oxygen, O2, the thing that we breathe, is being produced at the sea floor in the absence of light. And the reason that we call it dark oxygen is because it's being produced in the absence of light as opposed to at the surface in the presence of light, which is our typical understanding of how oxygen is produced, right? It's produced at the surface where photosynthesis is taking place, the use of light by organisms to convert it to chemical energy and split water and produce oxygen. A lot of people also commented on that video that photosynthesis doesn't produce oxygen, that oxygen is just a waste byproduct of their metabolism, and this is true. But that doesn't mean it doesn't produce oxygen. And yes, plants do respire oxygen at night. They take it back up at night when the sunlight is not available. However, this doesn't offset the fact that they produce more oxygen than they consume. In any case, oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis, which typically occurs at Earth's surface. However, these scientists discovered oxygen being produced in the absence of light at the sea floor, and this is significant because this changes the way that we fundamentally think about oxygen cycling on Earth, as well as oxygen evolution throughout geologic history, and potentially even changes the way we study the origin of life, which I'll talk more about later in this video, and even can change the way that we interpret finding oxygen on another planet or moon. The other major thing we talked about in that video was what is producing this oxygen, this dark oxygen at the seafloor. And the study that this is all based off of concluded that polymetallic nodules at the seafloor, nodules or concretions at the seafloor that contain multiple metals, are producing the oxygen through electrolysis. But this has brought up a lot of questions. The ones I saw most often in the comments that I will go through one by one in this video include: how are the nodules formed? How are they recharged if they're acting as geo-batteries to split the water and create oxygen? Where does the hydrogen go? If we're splitting water, its formula is H2O, so where's the H going? Can we replicate this nodule formation process instead of mining them if we know how they form? One of the big topics in the last video was that these nodules are of prime mining interest because of all the metals they contain. And we are obviously more hesitant to mine them, especially now that we know they produce oxygen, because that could potentially support more lively and higher life type ecosystems than we previously expected. And so there's all these questions and hesitancies when it comes to mining them now. And so some people were wondering if we can just synthesize nodules in like a chemistry lab. And so I'll answer that question as well. And then how much oxygen do they produce? How much do they contribute to the oceans and atmosphere relative to photosynthesis, say? And did dark oxygen drive the origin of life on Earth? And if so, how? And if not, why not? So let's start with the first question of how do they form? Well, these polymetallic nodules, or manganese nodules, or iron manganese nodules, all of these are referring to the same thing. These form on the seafloor as concretions, where essentially it starts with a nucleus or some piece of debris or sediment or a shell fragment or a tooth or any piece of something. That grain acts as a nucleus around which minerals precipitate. Precipitate in this sense, I don't mean rain, I mean essentially the formation of a solid out of a liquid. The way that precipitation of minerals from a solution, like seawater, works is ions in solution become so saturated in a particular area that they will crystallize. They will form crystals if the conditions allow. And one of the major factors that induces crystal formation or precipitation from solution is having a nucleus or a surface, a substrate on which a mineral can grow. And so this nucleus is kind of the beginning of mineral precipitation around it, and then iron and manganese hydroxide minerals precipitate around this nucleus, this grain, in concentric layers continually until they form a nodule. And as they are forming, they are incorporating metals, many metals, within either their mineral structures, their atomic structures, or adsorbing metals to their surfaces. Adsorb just means kind of like a surface interaction compared to absorb with a B, which means to absorb something within something. So absorb goes in, adsorb goes on. And so a lot of times these mineral surfaces are charged in a way that adsorbs or attracts metals to adsorb to their surfaces. And this can be a weak-ish interaction or a pretty strong one to the point that those metals become preserved in the rock record with the manganese and iron manganese nodules. And which metals they contain or adsorb or incorporate depends on how exactly they're formed, or essentially the source water that contributes to the precipitation of the metals that form the nodule. In other words, there are 3 ways that these nodules can form or precipitate from water. They can precipitate directly from seawater. These nodules are called hydrogenetic. Or they can precipitate from sediment pore water. In other words, the water that flows between pores of sediment before it's completely compacted at the seafloor. And these are called diagenetic nodules. Or they can precipitate from hydrothermal fluids near hydrothermal vents or mid-ocean ridges where there's really hot water circulating through newly forming crust, and hydrothermal vent fluid coming out of vents, which is sourced from the mantle, so it has different materials and all of that. And these are called hydrothermal nodules. And the reason these 3 types of formation are important is because different formation mechanism means different types of manganese and iron minerals, which means different metals are incorporated or adsorbed onto those minerals and preserved in those nodules. Hydrogenetic manganese nodules, those precipitated directly from seawater, predominantly contain hexagonal bernesite, which is a type of manganese oxide mineral, which is called a phyllomnganate because this is a layered manganese oxide mineral. And its hexagonal structure gives it what we call sheet site vacancies that adsorb metals differently than other manganese oxide minerals. For example, diagenetic and hydrothermal nodules contain mixtures of phyllomnganates, so layered manganese oxides like bernesite, but also tunneled manganese oxides or tectomanganates like todorokite, which is one type of tectomanganate. We can see the tunnel structure over here in this figure. These little gray polygons are manganese oxide octahedra, so the kind of building block of manganese oxide layers and tunnels. And then the black here is showing a thallium ion, so an example of what a metal ion in solution would be adsorbing to in terms of the adsorption sites at the surface of these different types of minerals. If you don't understand that, the summary is that these minerals have different structures and therefore adsorb different metals. And just a quick side note, I'm really excited about this because this is like the first video that I've ever done where I'm talking about some like newsworthy research where I get to actually cite myself. This figure is from a manuscript that me and co-authors from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution published last year about thallium sorption to manganese oxides, like I mentioned in my last video. And I'm really excited that, I get to include my own work in one of my videos. That's so crazy to me. Normally there's not like news in geology that's in my specific field of expertise, so this is really exciting. In any case, different formation mechanism equals different metals, but one of the major questions from the last video was how are they recharged? If these nodules are acting as batteries to produce this oxygen, how are they recharged to continually produce more oxygen? Well, metals have specific electrode potentials when immersed in an electrolyte, like salt water, seawater. And the potential difference or difference in voltages between metals within the same nodule causes an internal redistribution of electrons. And what do we know about the flow of electrons? What is that? That is electric current. Well, really the flow of charge, but in this case, the flow of electrons, which is the flow of charge, drives electrolysis. This electrolysis is what's driving the splitting of water and the oxygen production. So how I read it based on the study is instead of the nodules acting as batteries themselves, carrying out chemical reactions that directly produce oxygen, the nodules are acting as catalysts that catalyze the oxygen production. And catalysts don't need recharging. They just catalyze the reaction if it's favorable. But even so, they are continuously reacting with metals in their surrounding seawater. And this continuous exchange of metal ions at their surfaces, at their charged surfaces, provides them with continuously changing electrode potentials at their surfaces, and thus continuous redistribution of electrons within that surface mineral layer. And this redistribution or flow of electrons is what's driving the oxygen production. So in a way, they kind of are continuously recharged by this reaction with the seawater, because the seawater is not a closed system. It's continuously providing new metal ions to that surface, which is continuously interchanging with those ions. So oxygen is being produced by the electrolysis reaction, which is splitting water molecules. But what about the H in the H2O? A lot of people commented on the last video asking, well, what about hydrogen? Is hydrogen produced? Of course, hydrogen is there as well. We didn't forget about hydrogen. I just didn't feel that it was part of the discovery, so I didn't mention it. But yes, hydrogen is part of this process. Currently, we're still uncertain about what exact ratio of relative molecular hydrogen gas, H2, is being produced as opposed to just protons, because as you can see down here by the electrolysis reaction, it can go either way, or kind of both ways. It's probably both that are happening, both the production of H2 and H plus protons and hydrogen gas. However, if we do continue to study this further and do find that a significant amount of molecular hydrogen is being produced, this could be worth understanding a little bit better, because molecular hydrogen, if you watched my alternative energies video, which I'll link up to the top right if you're curious, could be a really important clean energy source for us moving forward. And its production, which we call the hydrogen evolution reaction, requires electrolysis, similar to what we're talking about in this video, but this requires catalysts that make the reaction easier and more economically viable. And so far, there's been a lot of research that's gone into finding really good catalysts for this reaction. A lot of my PhD work was focused on molybdenum and different molybdenum compounds that I wasn't really looking at for the purposes of HER catalysts, but a lot of people do look at molybdenum compounds and other metal compounds that catalyze this reaction. So studying these reactions going on at the nodule surfaces could be really important for, furthering this research. And if molecular hydrogen is being produced by this oxygen-producing reaction, it's likely consumed by organisms at the seafloor or within the water column, just like oxygen is, which I'll talk more about later. But if you don't know, there are many molecular hydrogen-using metabolisms that specific microbes use to gain energy. Not all organisms on Earth are like us and use oxygen and organic matter to metabolize. A lot of organisms use different chemicals and what we call chemosynthesis to gain energy. So there are a lot of metabolisms involving hydrogen, and that's why I think it's probably consumed before it reaches the sea surface or atmosphere. Now moving to the question, can we replicate this? If we know how the nodules form, can we just replicate the process instead of mining them? Well, unfortunately not necessarily, at least to my understanding, because these nodules essentially grow incredibly slowly, millimeters per millions of years, and over these millions of years, they're slowly concentrating metals at their surfaces and within their layers from the seawater, which only contains trace amounts of these metals. So ultimately, how they form and how we would need to replicate this formation process would require the metals themselves. So we could make metal-rich water, so we could form the nodules over time. We could potentially increase the speed of this process, but only by increasing the concentration of the metals in the water. And where would we get the metals? Well, from concentrated sources like these nodules. So it's kind of a circular question. We can't really produce them without the metals that produce them, which we would get from them. So I don't think so, based on my understanding, but that's just my initial thought. I could be thinking about this wrong. If somebody else knows a way that we could maybe produce these kinds of things, comment below. I'm curious to hear. And on to the next question. How much oxygen are these nodules producing? The short answer is we don't know yet. But even if we don't know the exact amount that these nodules are producing, it seems likely to me that the oxygen produced at the seafloor by these nodules is consumed before reaching the surface, just like we talked about the hydrogen. And so therefore, I would assume really no oxygen from these nodules is being contributed to the atmosphere, and that all of the atmospheric oxygen is largely a result of surface photosynthesis. That said, obviously oxygen is well mixed throughout the ocean, at least the modern ocean. We'll talk later about ancient oceans, but it is well mixed and circulated throughout the ocean. So obviously some of this nodule oxygen might eventually make its way to the surface cycle and therefore the atmosphere. But I can't imagine it's that significant an amount, or else we would have realized a long time ago that our mass balance for oxygen cycling on Earth was way off. But I don't know for sure. I really can't wait for future research on this to come out, because I'm curious how much this is going to affect our understanding of oxygen cycling. But anyway, a lot of people also commented on the previous video about how, oh, okay, this must be how fish and stuff in the deep sea get their oxygen. Well, not necessarily. Oxygen is present in the deep sea regardless of nodule oxygen formation due to ocean circulation and upwelling and downwelling. Ocean circulation is exactly what it sounds like, circulation of the ocean, and upwelling and downwelling is part of global ocean circulation. This is just essentially the upwelling or bringing up of really nutrient-rich, oxygen-poor waters from the bottom of the sea, the deep sea, up to the surface at continental margins, and then the exact opposite process, bringing nutrient-poor, oxygen-rich, fresher waters from the surface down to the deep waters to feed oxygen to the consumers below, like algal blooms and stuff at the surface, and then to bring nutrients up to the algal blooms. And it's, cycle. This is how we've understood nutrient cycling and food chains at continental margins throughout the ocean for, all of time up until now. And I don't think the nodules producing the oxygen at the deep sea changes much about this narrative. This oxygen circulation in the ocean that brings oxygen to deeper waters is what allows aerobic life like fish, sponges, corals, mollusks, and other animals to live at the sea floor. They require oxygen, and this is how they get it. Circulation, mixing of the ocean water column. And where there is a lack of mixing, we see a lack of this life. However, that said, an additional source of oxygen at the seafloor could contribute to deeper, larger, and more widespread aerobic ecosystems, especially in deeper open ocean environments that we might not have thought to look in before. Why? Because most upwelling and downwelling, so vertical mixing of the water column, occurs at continental margins, at ocean margins, not necessarily the open ocean. There is some that occurs in the open ocean due to current divergence and, different wave patterns, whatnot, that induce vertical mixing, but for the most part, upwelling and downwelling occurs at ocean margins, mixing the water, allowing oxygen to become well mixed, and organisms, animal-like higher life, to live at the seafloor. Whereas this new oxygen source from seafloor nodules is actually something that forms on the abyssal plain of the ocean. So this is essentially really deep open plains of the ocean where we wouldn't expect large animal ecosystems, but they might be there if nodules are there producing enough oxygen. My initial uninformed thoughts on this particular point is, while we see nodule fields and we see, pictures of these huge abundant areas of nodules, And there's not really huge animal ecosystems, so that makes me think they're not producing enough oxygen that would support huge animal ecosystems. Either that, or because they're just producing oxygen and not necessarily the organic matter that rains down from an algal bloom at a continental margin, maybe that's the missing piece, the nutrients, rather than the oxygen. Maybe the oxygen isn't the limiting factor for large animal ecosystems in the deep abyssal plain of the ocean. That's actually more likely what it is, now that I'm talking it through. In any case, the gist of how much oxygen do these nodules actually produce, and is it able to sustain animal ecosystems where photosynthesis can't, is we don't know for sure yet. More research is necessary. Next question. Lastly, I want to touch on the implications for the origin of life on Earth. Did dark oxygen drive the origin of life on Earth? Again, we don't know yet. However, we have some ideas. So first, let me run through our current understanding of the origin of life on Earth, which I'm not going to go super in depth into because we have a lot of questions surrounding this still. But our gist of understanding is that the origin of life occurred sometime between 4 billion years ago and 3.5 billion years ago based on fossil record, genetic evidence, all these things. But the first life on Earth was probably anaerobic. In other words, it didn't respire or use oxygen. We think this for a multitude of reasons, not just because oxygen is not likely to have been around then, but also because anaerobic microbes contain very primitive structures and genes and mechanisms that they carry out. They are very primitive and deep branching in phylogenetic trees. And also, when oxygen did first rise in appreciable amounts in the atmosphere and ocean, we see that they underwent a mass extinction because a lot of anaerobic life not only doesn't use oxygen, but oxygen is also toxic to them. And so this mass extinction would make sense if most of the life up until this point was anaerobic. In any case, this point that marks when oxygen first rose appreciably in the atmosphere and oceans is called the GOE, and this occurred around 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago, induced by the first oxygen-producing, oxygenic photosynthesizers, cyanobacteria. These cyanobacteria are thought to have evolved much earlier, up to 3.5 billion years ago, or potentially even earlier, and they didn't actually cause the GOE until much later because, one, they had to actually have time to spread globally and proliferate enough to cause such a drastic increase in oxygen in the global atmosphere and oceans, but also the oxygen that was being produced early on Earth at this time when there hadn't been any oxygen really previously, it was readily reacting with a bunch of the chemically reduced compounds, or compounds very reactive toward oxygen. And it wasn't until oxygen had reacted with all of these readily reduced compounds and ions that it began to build up on its own as molecular oxygen, O2, in the atmosphere and oceans. Once molecular oxygen did become abundant, aerobic life, oxygen-respiring organisms like ourselves, like animals, could evolve. But one caveat that could bring dark oxygen into the equation is antioxidant enzymes. Both oxygen-producing photosynthesizing organisms, like cyanobacteria, and aerobic life, like animals, require antioxidant enzymes, or enzymes that protect them from harmful reactive oxygen intermediates, like superoxide or peroxide. These oxygen compounds are harmful to our DNA, and therefore enzymes like superoxide dismutase or catalase or glutathione peroxidase help to convert these harmful reactive chemicals into water, making them harmless to us. And phylogenetics suggests that these protective enzymes evolved before the Great Oxidation Event. This raises the question, was dark oxygen around before the GOE, and did this trigger the evolution of these enzymes prior to the Great Oxidation Event? Maybe, but I don't think so, just based on my understanding and also some papers that I read up on this before making this video, because one, pre-GOE metabolisms like nitrification, or a nitrogen-utilizing metabolism instead of oxygen-utilizing metabolism, require very similar metal enzymes that could have easily been transferred to and adapted by early cyanobacteria. And two, and this is kind of the big kicker when it comes to this thought that dark oxygen was around before the GOE and potentially for the origin of life, and that is manganese nodules require oxygen to form. And so they probably weren't abundant or potentially not even present before the GOE. This is, I think, my biggest problem with the articles that summarize the main paper that came out about this, which stated, that there were implications for the origin of life based on this finding. Because to me, it seems we know the origin of life happened before the GOE, but based on how these nodules form in the presence of oxygen, requiring the presence of oxygen because they are oxides and hydroxide minerals, it just doesn't seem likely to me that these nodules would have started to form in a significant amount that would form oxygen before the GOE. They would have required the GOE to begin to form. At least in my brain, maybe there was some alternate type of reduced metal-containing nodule, like some sort of iron sulfide-based metal nodule before the GOE that could have also acted as a battery or catalyst for electrolysis of seawater. I don't know. I don't think so. But it just seems to me, because the reason that these nodules absorb and incorporate so many metals to their surfaces and within their layers is because they are oxides and hydroxides, which have certain surface charges that attract these metal cations. If they didn't have that, they wouldn't attract so many different metals, and they wouldn't have a variety of metals to create the electric potential difference within their mineral structures, which causes the flow of electrons and thus the electrolysis. At least that's how my brain works. I don't know. And so this brings me to my last point. If these nodules didn't induce the origin of life, could they maybe have induced the origin of more complex life after life had already obviously evolved? Well, we know that early animals, oxygen-respiring life, like the Ediacaran biota, lived on the seafloor as many animals do today. And until now, we'd always thought that upwelling and downwelling was what caused the mixture of oxygen to bring it to the seafloor and the deeper waters to allow animal life and other oxygen-respiring life to live at the seafloor. But, maybe nodules could have helped make oxygen a little bit more abundant, especially in the Precambrian, before oxygen was as high of levels as they are today. It might have caused local conditions to become more favorable for animal ecosystems. And so it might have helped things, but I don't think it was a primary driver of either the origin of life or the evolution of more complex life. I think the photosynthetic production of oxygen played a much larger role. And these are just my thoughts. So there you have it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it answered some of your questions. I know there's still a lot of outstanding questions out there, but it's so exciting to see everything that's coming out about this. And I'm super excited to see future research about it. And hopefully this won't be the only update or follow-up video I will do about this specific phenomenon. In any case, I do have a quick announcement. Apparently Hope wants to be here for my announcement. I am doing a live video here on YouTube, or YouTube Live, whatever you want to call it. I have never done this before, on Sean Wilsey's channel. He's also a geology professor that makes geology videos on YouTube here. And we will be going live together on August 5th at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So if you are available and want to check it out, you can meet us there. And yeah, it will be on his channel, and I will post more community tab posts for you guys to remind you guys before then, but I hope to see you all there. And that's all I got. Bye.